Welcome, everybody, to our latest in the Gildenhorn book series. And today we have somebody who's not only a brilliant thinker, but a close personal friend and friend of the Aspen Institute. Alec Ross, Industries of the Future is the book. Alec was a Teach for America Corps member in Baltimore, correct?
That's right.
What have you been doing since then? No. He ran the innovation at the State Department. In fact, I was at the State Department this morning for one of their conferences, and everybody kept saying it's a legacy of Alec Ross that they had put, that when he ran the office right next to Hillary Clinton, I mean, it was almost like a right hand for her, it helped create the notion of technology and innovation, both in how we deal with people around the world, but also how we manage things like the State Department. And then since then, he's now written this book, which is for sale, of course, and he'll sign it. But why did you write the book?
I wrote the book because, it sort of came out of an experience having a chip on both shoulders. Chip on one shoulder, having grown up in a public school kid in West Virginia, and the other having been a Teach for America teacher in West Baltimore, and recognizing that the kids that I grew up with and the young people who I taught in Teach for America had a really tough time in sort of the last stage of globalization and innovation, and anticipating that the next wave of technology and science-driven innovation was going to be as dislocating. Part of what I wanted to do was provide some tools to people to help deal with the anxiety and dislocation that's going to come from the next wave of these innovations.
And you have 3 kids, and we're talking about kids not just to come from a rural West Virginia or inner city Baltimore, but kids of all socioeconomic backgrounds are going to have to deal with a new economy.
No, that's right. I mean, I have a 13-year-old son, head of household is my 11-year-old daughter, and then a 9-year-old son. And then, part of why I wrote the book as well was to try to light a path for parents and for people newly entering the workforce. Because, for parents, the workforce that my 3 children will enter is very different than the one that I entered, and it's very different than the one that exists present day. And for people in the workforce today in their 20s, it's highly disorienting and very different. It's project-based as opposed to employer-based more often than not. And so part of what I try to do here is light a little path and say, all right, well, look, these are going to be the fields of growth. These are the places where growth will occur. These are the kinds of things you need to do to prepare yourself for your children or grandchildren.
Let's drill down to real specifics, though. Mm-hmm. Let's start with robots. Mm-hmm. What are they doing? Are they going to be friend or foe?
So I think the cartoons of the robots and the robots of the cartoons and movies of the 1970s are going to be the reality of the 2020s. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really a byproduct of 2 things. The first is modeling belief space. So there are things that were historically very complex for robots, like grasping, complex 3-dimensional actions. But because of mathematical developments, we're now able to take robots and give them tasks that were once necessarily 2-dimensional and can now be 3-dimensional. The second thing, which I think is wildly changing robotics, is cloud robotics. So let's go back to one of the movies in the 1970s. Let's talk about C-3PO. If C-3PO interrupted us right now, Walter, if he walked into the Aspen Institute while we're talking to these nice folks, he would say, "Oh goodness, oh my, excuse me," and he would go find an open, go sort of clunk over to an open seat. As a practical matter, what would have had to happen is an enormous amount of hardware and software would have to be whirring in that gold gleaming body for it to be able to, first of all, do the cognition to recognize that it interrupted a discussion, the ability to then speak, the mobility to then sense, the sensory ability to identify an open seat, the mobility to take the open seat. We're talking about millions, tens of millions of dollars of hardware and software. With cloud robotics, what this means is that the real C-3PO of the 2020s will be able to ping the cloud and be algorithmically instructed, "Oh, you've interrupted a discussion. Excuse yourself. Excuse yourself in English." And our sensors are picking up an open seat in the 3rd row, 2 over to the left. And so what this means is that robots are going to become very sophisticated very soon. And whether they're friend or foe, I can argue it either way.
Well, let me push back a little bit, which is 30, 40 years ago, people were talking about this. They were talking about artificial intelligence coming out in the 50s. No robot is even much closer to doing what you just talked about. Even though you're saying, okay, the cloud, someday it'll happen, but it's always 5, 10 years on the horizon. A 4-year-old could walk into this room, find an empty seat, sit down, and probably know they had interrupted. We're not even that much closer on having a robot who can do it.
So we do not yet have artificial intelligence that is equal to the brain, the neurological power of a 4-year-old. And I don't think we will soon. But if you look at what's happening right now in the rise of artificial intelligence, which is specific to right now, like 2016, I do genuinely believe we are in a different moment in time in terms of what the new capabilities are. And so if you think about sort of the long hoped for humanoid robots or the long hoped for advances in artificial intelligence, there weren't the data sets, there weren't the analytical tools to be able to program and drive the robots. So I do think that we are sort of chapter 1, page 2 in terms of what robots can and will be.
You know, ever since Lord Byron gave a speech in the House of Lords saying that the new technology of weaving machines were going to put people out of work, and he supported the followers of Ned Ludd, who became known as Luddites, and smashed them, people have always said, will this new automation put people out of work? Every data point we have from 1840 to the present is no. It
Correct.
Creates productivity, makes more jobs in the aggregate. Is it different this time?
I don't think so. I mean, most people who write books about the future, they're either utopian or dystopian. You know, it's all either, oh, we're going to grow up to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, and wise, and lacking for nothing, or written from the fetal position with fists clenched. You know, I'd like to think that the industries of the future is more up the middle, which is where I actually see life is, and a little bit, and net optimistic. And it's net optimistic in part because of your question, which is I do think that what this isn't going to do is create some of the massive loss of employment that is projected, because there's no history that suggests that labor displacement holds for longer than 2 decades. Agriculture is a great example of this. In 1870, 1 out of every 2 people in the workforce in the United States worked on a farm. 40 years after that, it was 1 out of every 3. And agriculture was always viewed as this exception. It's like, oh, you know what? These people have worked on farms for hundreds of years. There is nothing that they can or will do. Today, it's 1 out of every 50 people in the United States.
But when that disruption started to happen, let us say 1890 to 1910, America did a few big things, like decided, oh, high school has to be universal and free because we're going to move into an industrial age. Are we doing the right things to move into the next age?
Absolutely not. Because what we aren't doing are making the massive pivots that are necessary, pivoting from an industrial economy into an increasingly technology-rich, knowledge-based economy where labor is going from being dominantly manual to dominantly cognitive. In the face of these massive shifts, we have to make massive shifts in things like our education system. So vocational education, which isn't talked about at the cool kids table, I think is critically important and serves huge segments of the population. But the way that we deliver vocational education today bears no difference between today versus how it was delivered 50 years ago. Community colleges, I think the importance of community colleges are greater today than ever. We have to look at what the outputs are from our educational system and map the outputs of our educational system into the areas where there can and will be job growth. And absent our doing that in the United States, I know there are other countries that are doing that and that will outcompete us.
Now, you said that the aggregate jobs you don't think will go down. What do you think about the argument, I actually know because I've read your book, but I'll ask anyway, that it will hollow out the middle, that you'll have a lot of service jobs and a lot of high-end information jobs, but even the law clerk and the whatever will be displaced?
Well, I think that you know, as to paraphrase Darwin, it's not the strongest of the species who survive or the most intelligent, but those most adaptable to change. So I think that as automated labor displaces work that is not merely manual and routine, but increasingly displaces labor that is cognitive and non-routine, there are dangers to certain kinds of middle-class jobs being lost. They will be lost. And the question to me is not, is this good or is this bad? It's, okay, well, what are the other opportunities we're creating? So my father, love my father, but for 45 years, he did one thing as a country lawyer in Hurricane, West Virginia. He created the very large stack of papers that took 2 months to prepare and cost thousands of dollars when somebody wanted to buy or sell a house. Theoretically, it's cognitive work. He wore a tie to work, but it's also very repetitive. And that kind of work, which right now costs thousands of dollars and takes weeks, could and should, I think, ultimately be replaced by a combination of blockchain technology and artificial intelligence. And so that 2-month-long process becomes a 2-hour-long process, and instead of it costing $8,000 to $10,000, it costs $18 to $20. So it creates an enormous amount of surplus, consumer surplus, and what then ought to happen is the job that my father would have otherwise had, he now has the skills and abilities to do something else because we've made the right pivots in our education system.
Speaking of blockchain technology, one of the parts in your book is about the finance industry and the lack of disruption to some extent, but the disruption that is sure to happen with the codification, or is that what we call it?
That's right.
Codification of money.
Yeah, I made up a word, codification.
I knew you made it up, I just didn't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether it was codified or codified.
Yeah. You know, if you think about the industries that were transformed between 1995 and 2015, pretty much every industry in information and communication services was turned on its ear.
I'm sorry, what period to
1995 to 2015.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know, in those 20 years, information and communication services, you know, from advertising to searching for information, all
Weekly
these
news magazines.
Yeah,
I was there.
We all noticed, right? But there are certain industries that really didn't change. The legal profession, one. Finance was another one that was, I think, very slow to change. But I think that it will change, and I think that blockchain technologies and others are gonna take what have been sort of change-averse industries and are going to force change from within or from outside of them.
Give me a look 10 years from now of how I'm going to be doing my finances.
Sure. So I'll give you one example. So in going back to blockchain technologies, right now it is a real pain in the neck to move money around the globe. I mean, if you ever try to pay
Move money around the city.
Yeah, there you go. If you ever want to pay somebody or be paid from somewhere other than your bank, it can be a real headache. And the amount of friction, especially moving capital from frontier markets or developing economy markets into developed economy markets, look, there's a lot that falls off the back of the truck. What I do believe is that there are tools that are being developed right now that will take what has been a headache since the beginning of transnational payments and reduce it to near nothing. And I was ultimately convinced of this by the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein. You know, I had 3 conversations with Lloyd Blankfein about Bitcoin, about blockchain technology. In the first one, I asked him about it. I'm like, you know, what do you think about this Bitcoin stuff? He goes, it's crazy. You know, I don't know what, you know, how people are using it. In the second one, he said, you know, some people who work for me think it's worthwhile looking at, and so I'm letting them look at it as long as they do their other work. Then the third conversation I had with him was last year. And he goes, you know what, there's some interesting technology in there.
And you could have done that with Jamie Dimon, had the same evolution.
That's right.
Probably a month quicker, but they're going to...
And in December, Goldman Sachs filed a patent for something called Settlecoin, which is basically creating a walled garden where they can do basically move money around frictionlessly between their big banking partners and do asset settlements, in a way that previously hadn't been done. It'll save them a couple $1 billion a year.
Yeah, but it's also particularly important for the consumer, and for that matter, the underbanked consumer who can't move money around and go to payday lenders instead. I was just, as I said, over at State this morning, and it was interesting to me that the head of USAID, Helene Gale, and others were talking about in East Africa, mobile minutes and things, as well as in India. Are there things that, because this was your field when you were there, are there things we can learn from India and Africa about frictionless movement of money that we could apply to underserved communities here?
Yes, so sitting here in DuPont Circle, there are bank branches within walking distance. Whatever your big bank is, there's a branch nearby. But because there isn't a literal or proverbial main street lined with the local bank branches in Nairobi, they had to create ways of banking using an asset that they did have, which was their smartphone. And so they innovated, creating something called M-Pesa, which far outpaced what any of our electronic payment systems were. And about a third of Kenya's GDP now flows through this system, which is remarkable. If you try to pay for a cab in Nairobi with cash, the cabbie will be thoroughly irritated with you. He just wants to be paid mobile phone to mobile phone, which is much more advanced than we are. And what I think that this portends is that in environments of relative scarcity, they are solving problems that we don't perceive to be a problem necessarily in more highly developed markets like in the United States and in Europe. And mobile money was the first part of this, but what I see happening right now that is really interesting is in healthcare. Being able to use smartphone technologies and other such things to be able to do remote diagnostics, course of care compliance, and other such things, which I could see being very applicable here in the United States, which is taking root in some of the lowest income countries in East Africa.
Hillary Clinton last night used the title of your book, I think, in her talk, which is Industries of the Future, that we have to be able to win the industries of the future. How big of a political issue do you think this anxiety about the new economy is? And I know, full disclosure, you've been advising Secretary Clinton. How should a politician, other than Trump tapping into the anger that's caused by it, tap into what people want to hear about a new economy?
So I really think that I don't think this is something specific to Donald Trump either, by the way. I think that the reason why the political left has gone further to the left and why the political right has gone further to the right is the widely held and perfectly legitimate anxiety that a lot of people have about tomorrow's economy. So I think Bernie Sanders, for example, has spoken to a lot of people in this country, particularly young people, who feel enormous amounts of anxiety. And he's come up with some policies, but he too has figured out who to blame for this. Donald Trump, I believe, has tapped into that anxiety and picked out an entirely different constituency of who you have to blame for this. And so I think that you can just look at the math. Just look at the math of the voters who are basically wanting to hit the reset button, wanting to hit the button that sort of blows up the existing systems in Washington, and you cannot call that illegitimate. And so what I think is important is in the face of so many angry voters and so much anxiety in Middle America, like West Virginia, where I'm from, I think it's increasingly important to put forward an affirmative view of, hey, we're all in this together, and here is my vision for how America will continue to lead the world in terms of our well-being and in terms of job creation, and here are the specific ways we're going to do it. So instead of flinging feces, which I see, on cable news when I make the mistake of turning on cable news, I think that I think it's time for great leaders to emerge to say, all right, I understand the anxiety that you feel. Here are some things that we can do.
Give me a couple.
One thing I think we can do is we need to look at our education system. The one thing that's slower to change than Washington is public education across the United States. And I think that when I look at what other countries are doing, and not just little countries like Estonia or Scandinavian countries or Singapore, I increasingly see China making big, bold, important pivots, saying, hey, this is where the job opportunities are going to be. We're going to make sure that we are producing enormous numbers of engineers. We are going to make sure that we are producing enormous numbers of people with the skills and attributes that are going to be rewarded with a good job in the future. We've got to address the mismatch between the outputs in our education system and the needs in tomorrow's economy.
But that's not going to help the guy or gal who used to go to the Maytag plant. The Maytag plant's not there. They're angry.
So look, if you are in I'm 44 years old now. If you are my age or older, and you are angry and you are dislocated, it is hard medicine to be told that to take when you are told, oh, you need retraining, because humans are much more difficult to upgrade than software.
Right.
It's terrible. It's not a click of a button for us. Absent that, and this is going to sound cold-blooded, what we have to do is focus on their children and grandchildren, and then for those of us who are older, think about what our social compact is. What is the agreement between the governing and the governed? If you have worked hard for decades, if you have, played by the rules, what is your safety net? So I think that as scientific and technological trends that are already playing out right now grow stronger, I think we need to rethink what some of our safety net programs are. And in the same way in which we created a social compact at the beginning of the industrial age, I think we need a social compact for the information age.
And the social compact we created at the beginning of the industrial age, and then after World War II, when we renewed it or refurbished it, was basically your employer gave you your pensions, your health care, your sick leave, your benefits, and things were based on industrial age organizations, whether they be Time Inc. or Maytag. And now you've just told me people are not working in those type of companies. They're putting together gigs. So how do you create a new social contract when it's not going to be employer-based?
We have to create insurance systems and other such things where the organizing unit and where the economic unit is the individual.
So my benefits are all portable, and I have an insurance
Correct.
where my sick leave and my pay and my
Exactly.
days off and vacation.
And there are regulations,
Disability.
there are government regulations, just as there are significant.
But there is no such insurance right now I can get, right?
That's right. So if there is, but it's basically based on the actuarial models, and it's sort of a hybrid of the industrial age model as opposed to something that's really greenfield. And I also think, bluntly, that there's an enormous amount of money to be made here for the people who look at these problems with fresh eyes and say, I'm going to create the insurance company for the 21st
So in other words,
century.
you could create a company, maybe with some government sanctions, or regulations. That went to an Uber and said every time you have a driver, you should put 1/10 of a penny in this because that will be part of that driver's portable benefits. And likewise,
Workers' comp. So workers' comp is a perfect example of this. When people get injured at work or when they get sick at work, right now, if you are living in the gig-based economy, you are completely out of luck and you become dependent on the state, or you become dependent on a set of outside players. We need protections in the system so that if people are going to live more gig-based lives, if they're going to work in the so-called sharing economy, then there need to be systems that account for things like people getting sick or people getting hurt. And another issue, because the nature of this economy is so young, we haven't had people grow old within it yet. And so things like pensions, matched savings, and other such things are largely non-existent. And so these, especially as we grow older, we're only living longer. And so these are the kinds of things that need to be thought through. Companies built, government frameworks developed. They ought not be partisan at all. I'm sure that people will figure out how to make them partisan, but intuitively, I don't think of this as being partisan. I think of this as a new social compact.
Just for a little advertisement for the Institute, we've started in this field because it's so important, and try to make it nonpartisan. The chairs of it are Mitch Daniel and Mark Warner, who are chairing how do you create the social contract of the gig economy era. My last question before I open it up, big data, how is this going to affect what you talked about?
So I think land was the raw material of the agricultural age, iron was the raw material of the industrial age, and data is the raw material of the information age. He who owned the land, controlled the land during the agricultural age, had the economic power and the political power. He who owned the factories and controlled access to the natural resources during the industrial age had the economic and the political power. He or she who owned the data, controlled the data, or who can draw meaning out of the data in the information age are those that will have, I think, the economic and the political power. We live in a world right now, in March of 2016, with 16 billion internet-connected devices. 4 years from now, which is not very long, that number is going to go from about 16 billion to about 40 billion. So we are creating Pacific Ocean's worth of data. And being able to draw actionable business intelligence out of that, I think will be the foundation for creating tomorrow's great fortunes. I think, for example, about the commercialization of genomics, sort of a long hoped for and long hyped projected area of the economy, which is now becoming newly accessible because we have access to a Pacific Ocean worth of data, and we now have tools that are extracting meaning from that data. Fields like agriculture and others, which we don't necessarily think of technology-based fields necessarily, I think with powerful data analytics applied will help us feed the world. And so I'm very optimistic about what this means economically. I do think that socially, the rise of big data is going to create some really interesting challenges in society.
Including privacy and who owns the data?
Yeah, so I think privacy...
Do I own my data?
Yeah, no, look, I think that privacy as we know it is quickly evaporating. In a world going from 16 billion networked devices to 40 billion networked devices, I think we need to worry less about surveillance than we do surveillance. Everybody having a mobile phone that's video enabled. So our lives are going to become so much more transparent. And a thesis.
But isn't there much more of a silver lining than cloud there?
I think so. Look, so my view here is, well, first of all, let me say I'm really glad that there wasn't Facebook when I was in college. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But my kids, when they go to college, they will live in a world of, leaving little digital fingerprints. And here's what I think. I think everybody's going to have a scandal. And because of it, norms will shift. I think that human fallibility is going to become something that's more widely understood and accepted.
That's interesting.
Let's talk about drugs in the presidency.
Yeah.
Let's talk about drugs in the presidency. When Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992, it was a big deal, the question of did he inhale?
Yeah.
Right? Fast forward to 2008, Barack Obama was like, oh, I inhaled.
Yeah.
I inhaled a lot.
Yeah.
I liked it. And I did coke too.
Yeah.
Non-issue in the campaign. What shifted between 1992 and 2008? Norms shifted. Let's think about homosexuality. When I was in college, which was not that long ago, a little over 20 years ago, I went to a fancy school, top 10 school, but homosexuality was still this thing that was viewed as largely aberrant. Oh, that's the gay guy. On any college campus today, it's widely accepted that a significant percentage of the student body is homosexual. What happened? Norms shifted. So I think that all of this transparency that's coming with this real-time reporting of what people are doing, who they're with, I think is going to shift norms.
Go for it.
Regulated industries represented by lobbyists. I'll give you an example. So down in the General Assembly, they're trying to put restrictions on Airbnb.
right? Because it's a regulated industry, hotels. And so in order to make sure that we're not competing with a regulated industry, lobbyists are out in full force going, even though property rights are sacrosanct in Virginia. I own my house. I can shoot a trespasser if he walks through the door with impunity, but I can't rent a room. How are regulated industries who have well-paid lobbyists going to slow down the development of some of these industries of the future?
Yes, that's a great question. So with the loss of power is never given up willingly. And as taxis and hotels, for example, have found their business models challenged by new companies created by 28-year-olds in California, they're going to fight back using the tools at their disposal. Now, I do think that to a certain extent they're fighting against the tide of history as opposed to figuring out how to use certain of these marketplace tools more effectively themselves. It's in their shareholder interest for them to fight these industries. So it's hard to find fault with them to do it, even if I'm sympathetic with the sharing economy platforms. Here, one thing I will say, sort of bigger picture on this, is that if you're in an industry that hasn't changed much in decades, like the hotel industry or the taxi industry or something like that, if you aren't thinking about how to transform yourself, leveraging digital tools, some 28-year-old in California is going to do it for you. And you're then going to have to spend a lot of money on lawyers and lobbyists to try to slow the tide. You can't stop the tide. They can just slow the tide of change. And so, look, this is the classic tension between incumbent stakeholders and startups.
But to speak on the other side of that, in a way, I'm somewhat surprised at how quickly change has occurred. I know they're lobbyists, but if you had asked me 5 years ago whether the taxi cab industry would find itself almost decimated by an Uber in cities across the world, I would have said, no, they'll be able to resist for another 15, 20 years. Likewise, Airbnb, everywhere I go, there's Airbnb and there's Uber, and Travis and Brian and all the people who started those things actually won the war against protected industries. I think you have to look at other places where it hasn't happened, which is the banking industry. People haven't been able to say, I will disrupt banking, K through 12 education, medicine to some extent. So it's not, the lobbyists have lost a lot of these battles, I would argue. And
All they can do is slow
I know in Virginia
things
you're
down.
having some issues on Airbnb, but all they can do is slow it down.
All they can do is slow it down.
Yeah.
With regard to global businesses and markets in the next, let's say, 2 decades, what would you predict would be the most disruptive change that is not obvious to most of us today?
Global markets and industries, what will be the
Most disruptive change.
That's a great question. I'll say this first about markets, is there's a chapter in the book called The Geography of Future Markets, where I focus on what the attributes that are going to be for countries basically to position themselves well to be the home to the industries of the future. And so I look at sort of all this technology and science that we've been talking about, thinking about it in the architecture of 196 sovereign nation states. Thinking about markets and thinking about what a non-obvious change would be, let me point to one thing that I think is going to be crazy. One of the crazier predictions in my book, but which I think is going to be true. Let me do a little survey. Raise your hand if you speak 2 languages. Raise your hand if you speak 3 to 5 languages. Raise your hand if you speak 6 or more languages. Okay. In 10 years, I think all of you will speak more than 5 languages. Let me explain why. I believe that a little over 5 years from now, we'll be able to put an earbud in our ear, just like headphones for a cell phone. And at the speed of sound, when somebody is speaking to you in any of hundreds of languages, in a language which you don't necessarily understand, the voice you will hear in your ear is in the language that you want to hear it. And what's more, it won't be Siri's voice. The device will measure the frequency, wavelength, sound intensity, and other properties of the voice. And the voice you actually will hear in your ear will, again, at the speed of sound, will very closely approximate that of the speaker. What does this mean in terms of markets? Well, if you think about frontier markets that are very difficult to access, like Indonesia. If you go to Indonesia, if you're in Jakarta or Bali, there are enough French and English speakers there to do business. But if you want to go to any of the more than 1,100 islands where more than 700 languages are spoken, where there are enormous amounts of natural resources, interestingly, language is a huge barrier because every little patch of an island, they speak a different language. Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is home to enormous natural resources, 20% of the world's supply of tuna. Nobody can do business there. Why? Because they speak more than 800 languages. And so one thing that I think is going to have a big impact on this question of markets and making markets more accessible is people being able to hear whatever language they want to hear when somebody's speaking to you in a language you hadn't even heard of before.
Got it. Go ahead, just ask the question. Go.
I just want to say that your observation about us getting used to dealing with, scandals, I think it's already staring us in the face. Pete Weiner did an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday in which he is essentially trying to understand how it is that evangelicals have decided to back Donald Trump. And essentially what they've said is, scandal, schmandal. I think this guy can get the job done. The question I have is, when you were talking about the sort of scale of change you'd like to see in K through 12, it seemed to me, if I got this right, you were talking more in terms of skewing it so that it is delivering people who can fill certain kinds of jobs, have certain kinds of skills. And raises the question for me is whether in this model that you're talking about, does it mean that we're finally giving up the ghost on what was the original intent of K through 12, which was really more about civic education than commercial education, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. So without taking civic education to zero, I think that we do need to increasingly focus on commercial education. And if you look at some of what is being done, I think in countries like Germany and others, with very specialized apprenticeships, working outside of the traditional K through college model of you get a certain kind of education that pulls you through, but it stops at a certain point if you don't have sort of traditional academic bona fides and aptitudes. I think that is just going to leave too many people on the side of the road. Let me make one other point about education, though, and that is that I think one thing that is going to be increasingly important is interdisciplinary learning. So everybody talks about STEM, and that's important. But what I also believe is that the people who will actually be tomorrow's leaders, the people who are leading tomorrow's industries, are going to be those people who have an understanding of that which is scientific and technological, but who combine it with aptitudes that are traditional humanities in things like communications, behavioral psychology, and things like this. So I use Facebook as an example. As I've gotten to know Mark Zuckerberg a little bit, everybody thinks that Facebook was a product of a computer scientist from Harvard. And it's true. But what people underemphasize is Mark's aptitude in behavioral psychology. And I think Facebook is as much a product of excellence in behavioral psychology as a product of excellence in computer science. And so what's interesting to me is when I think about the Silicon Valley leaders who I really admire, they may have a technical background, but they have also assiduously developed skills in the humanities, whether it's economics, behavioral psychology, international relations, whatever. And I think that tomorrow's leaders are going to be those who really combine the two.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious, the United Nations just launched the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals which cover everything from poverty to climate change. And there are estimates that say that to reach those goals would require about $3 trillion of investment a year, which seems to create some tremendous commercial potential. And I'm curious in terms of how you think this sustainability era will affect the industries of the future.
That's a great question. I will be, completely straightforward and say that our clean energy future is one that I steered a little bit away from in the book, just because it's not what I am specifically expert in. Having said that, you can't really talk about the industries of the future without acknowledging the opportunity that comes with the threat of our having to figure out how to create a more sustainable future. What I will say is that the entrepreneurs who, at the very beginning of their careers, look at what the Sustainable Development Goals are, and then think about what the commercial opportunities are there. How can we execute against these goals in a way that work with the incentives that come with markets? That'd be a great way to think about your future. If you're in your 20s. I also think one negative consequence of very low. Let's go to climate change for a moment. While I'm generally pleased with our having exceedingly low costs for fossil fuels right now, because I think it's basically like it creates a huge amount of consumer surplus for people who are in the working class and middle class. One of the negative outcomes of this is I see increasingly dried up investment in R&D for clean technologies. And so what I do hope is that even if our fossil fuels are growing ever more affordable, I do hope that will not slow our investment in clean energy technologies, because they are necessary, and they will come from here or they will come from elsewhere. And what I hope is that they come fast and they come from the United States.
My question follows on this gentleman's question, but I first wanted to mention that I work in the education division at the NEH, and I couldn't agree more with your comments about the humanities. You've just mentioned now climate change. If you follow Naomi Klein and her latest book, it sounds like, our days are numbered, at least if you're on the coast, maybe even here in Washington. Do you address this whole, specter of climate change and rising sea levels?
Yeah, no, I don't. There are lots of people who are true experts on this. And in the topics that I tackle, from the commercialization of genomics to big data to cybersecurity to artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, these are all areas where I feel like I'm an expert, or where I can draw the expertise out of others in a way that is reasonable. And this is a field where I need to stand down a little bit because there are others who are more expert than me.
Yes, over here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation. I'm going to introduce something that might sound a little naive, but what about the happiness quotient in all of this? Alvin Toffler in 1970, in his book Future Shock, one of the things I remember all these years later is that he said that technology was going to increase at such a pace that emotionally we wouldn't be able to keep up with it. I think if we're not there, we're certainly getting close to that. Is there anybody out there really looking at how all this technology is improving our lives? I think there's a whole industry around, how does this work for individuals?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that question. One of the things that Walter and I were discussing before, when we were just chatting before coming in here, was I was making the point that GDP is a decreasingly accurate measure of well-being. Because what we are doing with all of this technology, we are creating what is simultaneously more bounty and more spread. So what do I mean by bounty? And I think that this ties to your point about happiness. Is the scientific and technological development creates benefits to society that are difficult to measure economically. So when I was growing up in West Virginia, only rich people, in the 1970s, only rich people had color TVs. Today, if you can go into a very low-income household and there's a flat-screen color TV with 200 channels on it. This is bounty. This is well-being. Whether we think that that is a virtue or not, it is people having access to things that they didn't previously have access to. And so I do think that as we live longer lives, as we have access to more information, more forms of entertainment, and other such things, our lives are being improved in ways that are difficult to measure economically. The flip side of this is that, again, going back to this thing of transparency, one thing that's really interesting is we are seeing so many of these idealized lives on our TV sets, through social media and other such things, that as we get more, we're actually being exposed increasingly to that which we do not have. And people are coveting that which 10 or 15 years ago would have been obnoxious to covet. And so I do think that there's real complexity in all of this. And as social media and as these technologies develop, what I hope is that there's some good old-fashioned academic research being done about the psychological and sociological effects of all of this.
Mm-hmm. Way back? Yeah. 2 in the back there. We'll get you next.
Sorry, did I? No. So I'd like to ask you about the intersection of disruption and corruption. Mm-hmm. I recently heard Sarah Chayes talk about her book, which is pretty discouraging, shall we say. And when I hear you talk about mobile payment systems in a frontier economy, what does that mean for progress against endemic corruption?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that. I think it is a powerful tool against corruption. And the way that I learned this, I had a project in the Congo where a problem I was asked to solve was the enormous amount of corruption from the Congolese generals, who the way that Congolese soldiers and generals were paid is literally these haystack-sized barrels of banknotes would be flown from the capital, Kinshasa, to Goma in the east of Congo. And what would the generals do? The generals would take all of the money, maybe give some of the money to the colonels. The foot soldiers, what would they do? They would get no money, so they then became the most corrupt people in society because they would shake down people and create checkpoints and all of this. And so a project that my team set up is we basically created a way that instead of haystack-sized barrels of banknotes being physically flown from Kinshasa to Goma, we created a system so that all of the electronics all the payments could be done electronically over mobile phones. Now, what's interesting is we actually had to get a bill through the Congolese parliament to get this done, and we did it, and we thought we were ready to declare victory. But then what happened was there was a little note in the bill that said the program would be administered by the central bankers in Kinshasa, and so the generals bribed the bankers. And so it took 2 years to stand up the program.
Gets back to your corruption on, yeah.
But, so 2 years after a bill got through the Congolese parliament and was signed into law by Joseph Kabila, the program was finally stood up, and it largely wiped out a lot of that corruption. Similarly, another project that I saw close up was the independence referendum in South Sudan. Everybody said that wasn't going to work. Everybody said the endemic corruption was going to keep that referendum from being free and fair. But we created, working with some external partners, an election monitoring program, again, leveraging mobile handsets, so that instead of a report being published in a month that said, oh, the referendum failed because it was corrupt, we were able to document intimidation and other such things happening in real time, and the hyper-transparency brought to it basically wiped out the corruption in the South Sudan referendum. It doesn't make life in South Sudan any better, and life in East Congo is still pretty rough, but these were sort of small victories against corruption.
Way back, yep.
Congratulations on a wonderful book. I have to read it. So the question I have is around multiculturalism, right, and the future of industry. So as we've seen over in the U.S. economy, at least, when we see shifts in the economy and the way that things are produced and manufactured, we see casualties. The poor, the least educated, the least skilled, particularly in this knowledge economy, sort of are thrown to the back burner, and we have to figure out ways to solve that because they couldn't keep up with the future of industries, right? And so knowing that the U.S. will particularly become very multicultural, very global, very majority, switch, how does that account for how we ensure that they're not left behind or people are not left behind, particularly, and I'll just throw this out, when we see a high information economy that doesn't hire people of color. When we also see, I think going back to the early question about big data, where it's not so much what the data will do, but it's what you said, the challenges of the data, the predictive analytics, the algorithms, the fact that there's still issues with digital due process, and the fact that people of color are slow adopters or more vulnerable populations. Just curious about that as a sociologist. How do we account for that? Because we're going to see a huge shift.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your asking that, and I do write a fair bit about it in the book. And one thing that I'll flag is, we oftentimes think of our algorithms as having been written by divine beings. They weren't. They were written by humans and therefore have all the fallibilities that humans have. And one thing that I think is actually dangerous about big data is it is inherently retrospective. It is looking at backwards-looking data. So if you work in HR, for example, and you are applying a big data program to figure out how to hire, and one of the key criteria you look at is other social connections within a company. So somebody who has the most existing social connections within a company is going to be a person who is quite likely to do well inside the company. If you think about that, that is inherently biased against people with the wrong social connections. And that can be white folks from West Virginia who went to public schools like myself, or it can be people of color who come from disadvantaged communities. And so we do need to be very mindful that, and if you're an HR professional and you're just getting something spat back to you on your computer screen, suddenly you feel guiltless, right? Because you don't understand the bias that is cooked into the algorithms, right? And so the first thing is to be very mindful of these things and don't let noiseless algorithms nudge you in directions that you don't understand. That's key point one. Key point two is, I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but I need to. This goes back to the social compact. So in a social compact for the information age, what we have to do is recognize that there are particularly vulnerable segments of society, and there has to be an intentional focus on making sure that these young people get the inputs that they need from a very young age. My 3 kids all go to public schools in Baltimore. Not the best school system in America. But my wife and I, who are both in Teach for America, are committed to public education, and our kids all go to public schools. But one of the things that we do is we supplement their educations in ways that other parents could not or would not. So 2 of my 3 children are taking Mandarin. 2 of my 3 children are taking computer coding, which they aren't getting in school. So in a new social compact and in an education in education systems that function, parents who themselves may not be particularly well educated or have the financial wherewithal that my wife and I have, or the graduate degrees that we have to be able to say, oh, they should be learning Mandarin, they should be learning computer coding. The kids should be getting that without sort of the supplemental efforts of relatively well-to-do, well-educated parents. So that I see as a product of a new social compact.
Second to last, okay, third to last question. We're going to do 3, and maybe since we want you to be able to sell books, we'll do an old Aspen trick, which is the 3 of you ask questions before Alec answers, and then he gets to pick and choose amongst the questions how he does it.
Yeah, I was just following up on the last question there and wondering about your view of developing nations and how they sort of would take part, as you put, pivot into this world you described of industries in the future.
Well, that's one of his great background strengths. Yes, and then here, and then we'll put all 3 together. And shout it out or pass, Developing nations, we're trying to remember all 3.
Well, and mine's building on that. So we have a group of staff here from the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, which are explicitly supporting entrepreneurship in developing countries and emerging markets, including our staff from Kenya and Mexico and elsewhere. And we are already working to support, to the earlier question, the entrepreneurs who are trying to use entrepreneurship to meet the goals of the SDGs. And I'm curious what do you think entrepreneurs need to be doing now to prepare for the industries of the future or to take advantage? And what advice do you have for us in our work to develop and support entrepreneurial ecosystems to help be ahead of that?
Okay, we're going to see, if you don't mind, whether you can keep 3 questions in mind. Is that all
Try-
right?
I'll try.
That way
Yeah,
you'll be able to
I'll be
sell
all right.
books. We'll be out
There we
on
go.
time.
There we
Yes.
go.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid this question takes you in a different direction.
That's okay.
I wonder if you could say something about the electric power grid of the future that underpins so much of the technology we're talking about. 2 specific points. We hear a great deal about the vulnerability of the grid to potential threats of sabotage by terrorists and others who might wish us harm. Whole different point. My local power company evidently cannot sense problems at remote locations. So if there is a power outage in my neighborhood, PEPCO doesn't know about it unless I phone in and tell them. That seems quite archaic. I'd appreciate your
Okay, smart grids, international development, and entrepreneurs.
Okay, I'm going to speak very briefly to these. So on smart grids, I do think that going to all digital grids will actually bring real-time intelligence to our previously incompetent gas and electric companies. So I actually think that with the vulnerabilities come benefits, both in terms of being able to manage the networks as well as being able to get actionable intelligence in ways that they previously can't through their analog networks. I could speak at great length about the cybersecurity of the grid. What I'll simply say is that in the face of all of these vulnerabilities, it's still worth modernizing that infrastructure. To the question, I'll try to blend the 2 questions about entrepreneurship in the developing world and about the developing world generally. The first thing I would say is the developing world is no longer one thing. There are 196 sovereign nation states on planet Earth. And I think that in the next stage of globalization and innovation, we can't say, oh, Asia this, and South America that, and Europe this. I think that we are going to see dynamics within continents that are wildly varied. Now, having said that, I'm extremely bullish about certain quote-unquote developing world economies. So the Pacific South American nations, for example, I think are exceedingly well positioned to compete and succeed in the industries of the future. Sub-Saharan Africa, I write about pretty extensively in the book. Again, I'm 44 years old. When somebody does a blank reaction to me, what was Africa 20 years ago? I would say a center of conflict and development assistance. If you say that to a 24-year-old now, they're saying it's a new market. And some of what I see coming out of sub-Saharan Africa is spectacular. And if you gave me $1 and said, put it on a piece of the map where that dollar is going to appreciate in value the most over the next 10 years, I would put it down in sub-Saharan Africa. Being careful to not put it on Northern Africa. Put it on sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of how you nourish entrepreneurship, particularly in the developing world, I think that there are 2 things that are needed more than anything else. The first, it's going to be obvious, but it can't be done without it. It's access to high-risk early-stage capital. That's still, you travel all around the world, and the conditionality placed on access to early-stage high-risk capital outside of the United States is crazy. Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, these guys would never have been able to start their companies outside the United States. Not only could they not have access to the capital, they couldn't have gotten a meeting where they could have made the ask in the first place. So access to high-risk early-stage capital. And number 2 is mentorship. So the creation of Silicon Valley, such as it is a product of 40, 50, 60 years of ecosystem development. And even in a world that is increasingly connected, where one would think, oh, it doesn't matter where you are physically, it actually does matter where you are physically, because we so benefit from mentorship, from human connections, from the professional systems that exists in and around things. And so if you are working in places where there are few examples of previous success in the private sector and in entrepreneurship, then you have to very intentionally bridge build between people who have been successful entrepreneurs and who have been a part of a successful ecosystem and that place where you want it to occur.
Wow. The industries of the future. Yeah. Alec, you've been great.
Thank you, Walter.
As always.
No, thank you, sir.
Book is for sale. Ask more questions out there. Thank you.
Thank you all.